to say thank you for all those who made this event possible, in particular the Department of Theology and Religious Studies and the Connolly Chair in Christian Theology, which I'm happy to hold. The Augustinian Institute, the Department of Philosophy helped fund this conference, along with the Augustinian Chair and Halloran Philanthropies. I also want to give a very special thank you to Mary Polier, who's our administrative assistant in the department, but a deep, deep, heartfelt thank you in particular to Gregory Hansel, who is a graduate student, a doctoral student at Villanova, and who really, for all practical purposes, made this event possible. So many, many thanks, Greg, for all your work here. This evening, hopefully you all have a schedule that you can see what we're doing tonight and then what we'll be doing tomorrow. This evening, we are very happy to welcome Dr. Philip Clayton. Dr. Clayton holds the Ingram Chair at Claremont School of Theology and directs the Comparative Theology's PhD program. He is a graduate of Yale University and has taught at Williams College and the California State University, as well as holding guest professorships at the University of Munich, the University of Cambridge, and Harvard University. His leadership roles in theological education over the last 15 years include serving as the immediate past dean of the Claremont School of Theology, obtaining funding for and launching the CST online program, and leading a Ford-sponsored program on rekindling theological imagination, and a Carpenter-sponsored program on reimagining theological education. Dr. Clayton has been a leader in interreligious education and dialogue for more than 2 decades. He helped launch an early collaboration of Jewish, Muslim, and Christian scientists, expanding it into a global 7-year program. He has organized conferences at Harvard on Judaism, Buddhism, and science, and has participated in programs on Islam and science and Abrahamic partnerships. Dr. Clayton lectures widely, works with various religious and environmental organizations, and supports constructive partnerships across the world's religious traditions. He has authored, despite all those many activities and all his travel, he has authored or edited 24 books and published some 300 articles. Some of his books include God in Contemporary Science, The Problem of God in Modern Thought, and one of my favorites, Mind and Emergence, From Quantum to Consciousness. This evening, Dr. Clayton will lead off our conference with a talk on the question, does mind emerge from matter? Dr. Philip Clayton.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I had to change the title because I loved M&Ms as a kid, and I noticed that this conference had double portion of M&Ms. And I always think a conference is a challenge to see if you can take on a new set of questions and adapt what you've done before in light of that. So you guys can evaluate how I do this evening. If mind emerges from matter, what does that tell us about the nature of mind and matter? Is this emergence mystical, or does it fall squarely in the domain of science? In the next few minutes, I want to push the scientific explanations of mental phenomena as far as they can possibly go, in the hopes of convincing at least some of you that it's not necessary to postulate any additional transcendent reality. In other words, if I do a good job of making you worry about the science, I'll deconvert 23%. No. But you should feel at least uneasy. You should feel queasy in the pit of your stomach. And then I'll try to pull you out of it, but I should lose a few. I know the conference is looking for the inside story, but I want to push back a little here at the start. Ilya says, uh-oh. You will have a better idea whether the arguments for the inside story really hold if I come as a skeptic. And so for perhaps that reason, it behooves us to start by thinking about the challenges. The way I would put it is I would attack my own position, emergence, from both sides. So first, you can imagine a classical theist attacking this position of emergence. And she might say, well, emergence can't give you a robust enough Christianity to be orthodox enough to bear that name. We could go through problems for Trinity, Christology, resurrection, and the like. So, for example, in the end, the theist might say, it's that naturalism that seems to be a part of emergence. It's what makes it so problematic. You see, the emergent starting point is a purely naturalistic picture of the world rather than God's creative activity. But you can't get from God, you can't get to God from naturalism alone. So if you don't build God into the picture from the outset, you can't derive God at the end. So you can imagine the theist sort of saying from the outset, this isn't going to work. To which the naturalist responds to the emergentist, my position, no, this isn't going to work. It's not naturalistic enough. And remember, when you get attacked from both sides, it's always a good sign that you're in the right place or in a very wrong place. So the naturalist says, I don't share any of the assumptions of these theists who've been attacking you. You have the opposite weakness. They recognize the role, you recognize the role of increasing complexity in the natural world, and you affirm that everything in the natural world is composed of matter, energy, and nothing else. But then the critic continues, so you've got this big picture from quarks to cucumbers, from genes to Guns N' Roses. So you admit that emergence has produced a brain that's complex enough to think about things like Harry Potter and Hogwarts, or to invent the Greek gods, the system of the Greek gods, for example. But there's nothing, says the critic, otherworldly about human behavior and thought. You can call pain, emotions, and thoughts mental or even spiritual as if you want, as long as you remember that they're products, however interesting, of the nervous system, hormones, and neuronal firings. Do you see how we get pushed in both directions? And so they'll say, this is where emergentists, who are also theologians, go really, really wrong. It's not surprising, they say, that brains produce mental representations that influence behaviors. After all, that's what brains evolved to do. So when complex brains, they insist, are not paying attention to the important things, those that increase our reproductive fitness, such as watching out for lions or actively looking for sexual mates to copulate with, in those unimportant times, then they can produce ideas not tied to any empirical reality, such as gods, transcendent realms, and dreams of world peace. Don't worry, they say, enjoy the feelings and fantasies that your theological ideas produce. Just don't be fooled into thinking that you're thereby discovering or experiencing transcendent beings and realities. So you see the tug on both sides. The naturalist says, I will never be satisfied with what you're doing with emergence. The theist says, I will never be satisfied with what you're doing with emergence. Maybe I should go home. So the challenge is to try to find answers to both sets of objections here tonight. To really connect with contemporary science, to convince the naturalist we've really listened to her. We have some sense of what her position is. And then to see if I can make connection with the other three M's, mind, meaning, and mysticism. So I have to do it in a way that I satisfy the naturalist, that's also my standard, right? But not ruin Ilya's conference. That's my hope. So then I head into a very deep and incomprehensible philosophical analysis of what's wrong with certain positions. So I will not look at my notes and see if I can say very simply what this criticism is from a naturalist of the way that most Christian theists and metaphysicians approach this question. I identify two major positions. One says that there's a continuum that continually changes across evolution. Let's just take one example. There is, early on after you have self-reproducing cells, a kind of proto-agency. Unicellular organisms do something in their environment. Stu Kaufman says they're out to earn a living in their world. That is, if they move their little flagellum and head up, think they're heading up a glucose gradient, but it's actually toward a toxin, they die. And to die is different from a chemical solution. It is to fail in the task of being a living being. And so you can follow this continuum from a sort of proto-agent to full agents to maybe proto-personhood to full personhood in a human being, and then to a God who's more than personal. Do you understand? This kind of position has a continual process of growth, a continuity, but moves through those stages from amoeba to God, as it were. There's another set of positions that take there to be some fundamental metaphysical reality that's present in everything that exists. We'll be talking tomorrow about panpsychism, so please come back. And panpsychism says there's one thing, so psyche, right, a psyche, that's present in everything that exists. I come by this honestly because I'm from Claremont, where John Cobb has been teaching this for 50 years. I mean, it's actually born into the wallpaper somehow. But that is, and oh, the other claim is you can't derive something like mind if it wasn't there from the start. So panpsychism says there's a fundamental principle shared by everything that exists. You see how those two positions are similar yet different, right? One has a principle of continuity over time. The other one says there's a certain fundamental reality. It might be the divine spirit. It might be temporality, or it might be psyche. Actually, in John Cobb's student, David Griffin, it's called experience. Everything that exists doesn't necessarily have a psyche, but it has experience. So pan-experientialism. I don't like the sound of it as much. All right. Now let me try to do the story of naturalistic emergence. And I promise to show pictures. So here, by the way, is the task. I'm going to leave it on the overhead for a while. You need to know that this was in the advertising brochure and that every speaker had to sign that he or she would address this task. I'm not going to read it, but it's a moving statement, and it's the standard to which I was held or they withhold the check. My hope now is by this point you're feeling a bit suspicious. If you sense that starting with naturalistic emergence and pulling God out of the hat must be some sort of sleight of hand, you're probably right. Marrying divine action and emergence looks like a bit of a shotgun wedding. What happens if we step back from the theological assumptions for a moment? Let's let the problem, matter in mind, be as hard as it really is. So let's not start with a theological solution and then sort of work backwards to create science in the natural world. Let's talk more carefully about the boundaries of natural science by understanding how it works in the first place. And actually makes things far more interesting because they become far more difficult. So if we want to make claims for this synthesis of all four of the M's that you see up there, then we need to make sure that we haven't smuggled in our conclusions by hiding them within the science from the very beginning. See the danger? Right? Humans always tend to start with what they want to prove, and they can be sure that they prove it. So I think we need to cleanse our science from other assumptions and see how bad the problems look. It's much more fun that way. So let's try to do it. How hard is this task if we don't take the shortcuts? And I'm going to argue that it's really hard. So now we're going to find out if I can move and you can still hear me. It sounds like you can't really, but I should just speak loudly, right?
You can turn on the bell mic.
Maybe if I took it off mute, do you think it would work better? Now this, for a professor, is called high-tech. So even finding the non-mute button. Now I'll bet I'm louder.
Yeah.
See, this guy is good. Give him a doctorate. All right? And now it's kind of a weird reverberation noise. I feel like I should be introducing a rock band. All right? So I'm going to try to convince you that there are three kinds of emergence. There is a reductionist emergence, There's what I call strong emergence, and then there's an expanded emergence, which is getting a big role in the recent literature. In the end, you're going to find that they're all naturalistic, and that I'm going to say no at the very end. But now you can hold my feet to the fire to see if I really convince you. The strongest case, I believe, is that the physical sciences have what we call a weak emergence. That is, that well, let's see what the definition is. Relatively simple building blocks. I have to be able to see it too. Relatively simple building blocks, arranged according to relatively simple laws, produce phenomena of greater complexity. The building blocks remain physical. The laws are the laws of physics. And the outcome is more complex than the way you started with. That's different from what we're going to need in biology. And here's John Wheeler's way of describing this weak emergence. The important thing about weak emergence is that the complex systems that it creates remain physical systems. And I mean by that they can be studied by physics. So, for example, we have pretty good bridge laws from physics to chemistry. So we can watch the composition of chemicals and trace them back and sometimes work out the dynamics using physical laws. So now we get to do the pictures. We have whatever the dawn of time was for physics. You have this perturbations in a quantum soup, as they sometimes say, this period of rapid inflation till this is the WMAP satellite. Look at the universe, 380,000 years. We actually have a newer image now, and then up to where we are. The argument is that, and I think it's clear, that's an increasing complexity. Let's watch it in real time. And this is the classic picture everybody shows that gives you a sense. For example, there's a dark ages where no light has arisen, and the first stars only come about 400 million years, and all these steps. We could do a whole evening just on that, which might be more interesting than this one. So then it's going to be a Hollywood ending or something. But you get a sense of the continual emergence of these new structures that weren't there at the moment of the Big Bang. Purely physical emergence. Nothing, if I may, spooky about it at all. You can do the equations. And then we have you get a sense of the emergent structures if you go to the NASA photographs. There's some of the, I mean, you've seen them often, but they're just such incredible. When you take the states and you give them a visualization, it's staggeringly beautiful, as is our planet in that famous Earthrise photo from what, 1968? Was it the first astronaut? 68. I love that picture too. It's getting dirtier though. Biology is and isn't like that. That's the point that I want to make as we follow this line of emergence. Stu Kaufman and I argued some years ago in theoretical biology that you cannot express the dynamics of biological systems using physics. It's not just that we don't know, that it's impossible, even in principle, to tell the developments, say, in Darwinian evolution using the laws of physics. So we have to have some way to recognize how it's different, and yet to acknowledge that biology is fully scientific, fully naturalistic in how it develops. That's our next task. So we'll start from Van Helmont in 1648, all life is chemistry. That's the opposite position from what I'm saying. All life builds on chemical systems, but has a dynamic, as we might say, and therefore needs explanatory categories that are more than physics. We can actually compose this table from chemistry, or actually from physics, in a mathematical way. It's derived closely from physics, and yet the properties of the individual elements couldn't be predicted from the lower level. The placement can be computed, but the properties can't be predicted. Even more so as we begin to look at, what is this? DNA. The DNA molecule. We have incredible knowledge of the chemical structure of this molecule. Adenine, guanine, thymine and cysteine. Look at its exact understanding of the particular structure. We also know how it works from the bottom up. It would be fun to have that little laser. Does anyone have a laser in their pocket? I'll get it. During the halftime, I'll go down and get it. But you can see, basically, we have the DNA strand. It codes for proteins, which are the workhorses of the cell. Right? Molecular machine is the phrase I want you to look at. And then they do their work in the living cell, community of cells, and we go on from there. Right? You see the building, but not in ways that can be predicted from the periodic table. Boom. Molecular machine to watch the proteins actually be transported around the cell and to do their work of repair and growth is amazing. In fact, that we could even understand protein folding, which is this massively complex structure, form that lets proteins do their functions, is also amazing. It gives you the sense of how much of life can actually be explained by moving downward, by understanding the basic elements. Remember the construction picture? If you go back, let's see if I can do this without, there we go. You can move backwards, it looks like you get mechanism, and then you move forwards. The thing is, you can't completely, because kinds of dynamics emerge in that process that you can't read off of the fundamental elements. For example, epigenetic effects, effects that might be caused by the community of cells, bring a need for an individual living cell where it needs proteins, and the proteins there actually can be transpositions, transposons of the rungs of the ladder so that it will produce the kinds of proteins that it needs for the sake of the cell. It's not the kind of neat story of construction or mechanism that you might expect. And yet, it's purely naturalistic. That's the tension that I want to...
But this crucial change...
Okay, we heard you. Okay. Now let's look at life forms to try to make my point that the epigenetic environment, the broader environment in which a life form unfolds and which supplies the selection pressures that cause it either to fill up its part of the ecosystem, its niche, or to fail, to become extinct. It's a kind of dynamic very different than what we've looked at so far. So do you know what this is? This is what's in your mouth. These are the kind of bacteria swimming around, and even if you brush your teeth, they're still there, right? Larvae? Now, I don't think these are in your mouth. I'm hoping not. Here's a larva inside a branch, a root. Okay, these have evolved with the same DNA structure, but they take their forms from environmental factors, from interactions over generations and generations, thousands, hundreds of thousands of generations of development, which gives the particular structure they have. And the structure of all these different living things. Fully natural, says the emergentist, fully can be traced back, but not derived from the same sort of basic chemical elements. So much of what you see, form, function, color, structure, come from those interactions with the environment. Actually, for evolutionary theory, virtually everything possible comes from that environment. Evolution is about continua, not about radical breaks. Well, let's watch where it goes. So here we have sperm and egg. The chemistry of these two structures we know as well as we know anything else. We're really interested in our gametes, our germ cells. This is the fertilized cell in metaphase. Chemical, yet producing a living being that, given the size of our brains, probably thinks thoughts that have never been thought before, has ideas, feelings that may be unique to that individual, what we call personality. And yet, traceable back to this, completely natural, and at the same time developing in a way that could never be derived from this moment. And I mean never, not even in principle. So do you see this kind of emergence, the complexity now of it? It's weak in the sense that you've got the fundamental states that take new forms, but it's strong in that it produces new kinds of agents, new kinds of organisms. More than in physics, where you just have different shapes of the physical system, now you have new kinds of agents themselves. And with this, we began to move toward the expanded. Let's see where it takes us. Continuum, these are bonobo brains, human brains. Look at the difference in striation, in the number of levels. So you know that the performance of this more complex brain, roughly 10 to the 11th neurons, 10 to the 14th neural connections, will be able to produce phenomena, produce properties that you won't find in bonobos. Can you say in advance what they'll be? This is actually the most complex organism system we know in the entire universe. But we can't predict exactly what it will do. The naturalist says, however, this is a natural evolved organ. Nothing mystical here at all. I'm trying to worry about the fourth M. Right, here we go. More. Right, so the human brain evolved for particular functions and has particular properties that it produces. I like this brain. As the brain, so also the organism, right? Or maybe no brain at all. I want you to watch, again, the brain is a natural system. That is phenomenal. That is great science. And arguably, it's bad news for the emergentist theologian. The more fully we understand the brain, then in principle, the more fully we understand its byproducts. Like your awareness right now that your left toe hurts, right? Or the incessant worry that you left the water on in your kitchen. Those behaviors, those mental products, have everything to do, or so we fear, with this structure, which we're understanding more and more fully. That kind of naturalism not only makes me worry, I think it's false. So let's talk a little bit about how we may need to expand naturalism to deal with the phenomenon that we're looking at now, which is human thought, feelings, and experiences. Right? So expanded naturalism is willing to take them as real existence, but insists that we still look at them in a completely naturalist context. My favorite sort of story of this is the Dalai Lama. He came to work with Richie Davidson in Wisconsin, looked at the studies of PET scans, early PET scans actually. He looked so interested, right, in how this machine works. He didn't look bored at all. He's probably going to tell a joke. And, oh, there's Richie. And then here's the result, the data, the difference we find between experience. Well, here it's a Buddhist monk at rest and during meditation. And we can actually follow the particular differences in blood flow to recognize these are famous pictures. This is sort of the icon for me of expanded naturalism. Right? Here's a monk doing what he's been trained to do for, 10,000 hours of compassion meditation, hooked up with electrodes and giving data to a machine, helping advance naturalistic science through the inner experience of the ideas, the compassion, and a religious state. See the complexity now? It feels like this is right. It expands the naturalism from anything reductive to the rich reality of the ideas themselves, yet retains the naturalist position. You see the both hand? So we're sort of skirting, and we're not skirting on thin ice. We're taking the argument of naturalism as far as you can possibly take it, which I promised you was the goal of this talk. How far can we go with a naturalist assumption? And you might not have thought in advance that we could go as far as the efficacy of ideas. The content matters, and the things that they do in the world matter. That's how far we've gotten, right? See where else it takes us. Well, it gives us a continuum. Okay, so now let's watch what expanded naturalism can do. I guess I moved What expanded naturalism can do when we see how far we can take it into the areas of culture and religion. There's nothing supernatural about cultural differences among human beings. We can trace those. Once you have the efficacy of ideas, you can trace all the different forms that we develop in social and cultural context and religious context. This is a highly cultural picture, do you realize? Yes, you do obviously realize that. We could go on. Yet, even for expanded naturalism, it must be limited to the functions, social, cultural functions of religion. So it can't get to the question of the truth of religious beliefs because it can only look at their functions in biological, social, cultural systems. And this is the worry. This might be the point where things could go bad. A fully functional account. So let's see where it actually takes us. We can take the things that inspire us and recognize how many are footed in the natural world. These are moments that evoke strongly spiritual responses in me. That one is the response to run. Right? So one can measure spirituality, one can track it, one can recognize its mystery, but one, from the naturalist perspective, can't pursue the ideas on which it's based. We can look at the way people dress and act, but not on whether Atman is really a part, the soul is really a part of a universal Brahman. Right? I can say, that if you hold those beliefs, what might you do? But that's a very different question. And so that's where I want to take us. These three naturalisms that I described, the weak emergence, the strong emergence, and what people call expanded naturalism. Now, is there a step beyond that? And this is what I want to do in the final part of the talk. Actually, we'll have to just, they're wonderful quotes, but we only need this one. Francis Crick's reduction of all of our joys and sorrows to the role of neurons. We kind of saw that already. Expanded naturalism, it allows us to have new perspectives, right? But it's bad news for religion, because religion becomes an adaptation deploying counterfactuality with a long evolutionary past. Not probably what most religious people are hoping that religion evolves. And look at Jerome Stone on religious naturalism. It focuses on this world. There's no ontologically distinct and superior realm, God's soul or heaven, to ground, explain, or give meaning to this world. And that's our challenge. If we stick with the naturalism, that's what we end with. Now here's a quote from Panneberg, my advisor, and I'll let you read that to get a sense of what it would mean to move beyond the naturalist perspective. And I'd like to close by following that line into the 4 M's of this talk. And I've decided to do the pages in random order because I think it'll be more entertaining that way. If one's missing, it'll be even more entertaining. All right, here we go. So let's see where this argument takes us for the themes of the conference. Descartes, matter and mind. Well, Descartes' split between matter and mind, or thinking things and extended things, has not done well, actually, for either side. Let's move on to number 2, mind. Mind, or mental properties, have had a much harder time of it. So minds as ontological things. Recent philosophy of mind brims with reductionist positions, though almost none of them is Cartesian. We looked at Francis Crick, but we could talk about the eliminative materialism of Paul and Patricia Churchland, the new atheist Daniel Dennett. He writes so well, I want to spend the whole evening just giving quotes from him, which are brilliant. Or offhand comments you hear from neurologists in hallways. I remember one, wires and chemicals, that's all we are, wires and chemicals. Mind is having a hard time in the field today. So I've taken on, with expanded naturalism, taken on those who would eliminate mind altogether. I haven't done it head on, but by arguing for this broader interpretation of emergence, interpretation of biological evolution as a whole. All right, here we go now, themes of the conference number 3, the mental and the internal. Let's assume for the moment that the emergentist argument I've made here is to some extent correct. In Homo sapiens, with our, relatively speaking, massive brains, inner experiences have emerged as well, as most of the people you meet at parties will tell you. In fact, it's probably impossible to conceive consciousness without interiority, even if you're an epiphenomenalist. And it is impossible to speak of qualia, namely the internal mental experiences of the world around us and of our bodies, such as the experience of seeing red, without postulating an internal mental realm, since qualia are actually defined in those terms. In fact, that's the reason why I dragged you through so much biology and evolutionary theory. Too often, religious people hand themselves mentality and interiority since they need it, for example, in order to speak of a genuine experience of God. Why hand yourself something for free when you've already earned it? So I think we can make sense of interiority and the rising of these ideas through the kind of expanded naturalism I just described. Like the question of belief I talked about earlier, the turn to interior experience that the broad naturalists tried to make failed. Let me say that again. This turn to deal with, to comprehend inner experience by these expanded naturalists actually fails. I want to show you why, which is going to propel me to the final 2 M's. The movement to the internal exceeds the capacities of scientific study, I argue, which is by its nature external. Human consciousness, indeed the interior mental life as a whole, manifests qualities that cannot be reduced to their external manifestations. Research limited to the outside lacks the tools to grasp the inside. This limitation can't be circumnavigated. As long as there are some qualities that can only be comprehended through the conscious or unconscious space in which they arise and live. That's the argument. Of course, some critics claim that nothing is internal and mental qualities therefore can't exist. Daniel Dennett. But given that most or all of you are convinced that you do have direct access to a wealth of inner thoughts and experiences, theirs is a hard case to make. It's hard for them to convince you of something that you seem to know more clearly than anything else in the world, namely that you have an inner life, that you have access to thoughts which are, by their nature, interior. Hence, any set of inferences that carries the interior or subjective dimension with it, and especially this dimension of mystical experience, will not be naturalistic only. Number 4, do all existing things have internal experience, even electrons? But now that I've realized my brilliant colleagues are going to talk about this tomorrow, I'm going to skip over that. But it's an interesting question that we'll debate tomorrow that you should come back for. Do all existing things have an interiority, internal experience, or is it just beings with very large brains? What is the internal experience of Kanzi, whose brain is more complex than most mammals? And is it identical to ours? Those are great questions, so I don't know the answer. Come back tomorrow. Now, imagine a mystic who experiences that all existence is permeated with the presence of God. His belief is not an inference from logical principles. It's an immediate awareness. In that sense, this is controversial, in that sense, the mystic stance is not in competition with metaphysical positions, say panpsychism. His experience of all finite things as being permeated by the Spirit of God, on the one hand, and the metaphysicians' inference from philosophical principles say that even electrons have flankies, are fundamentally different. They're not just the same, in fact, they're not part of the same language game. Let me make this point differently before I get to meaning and mysticism. Purely rationalistic claims about God might not even need to have a quality of interiority. I often wonder whether the ontological proof, the so-called modal proof, could be run on a computer. It's an interesting question. Think about it overnight. That's your homework assignment. All right, and finally, meaning and mysticism. The interior and the mystical, not only subjectivity is at stake here, but so also are beliefs about fundamental reality. Human thought, or is it spirituality, almost inevitably progresses from reflection on individual experiences in the world, reflection on the world as a whole, to the question of a possible ground of all existing things, and from there to the possibility that this deepest ground could be divine. Let's talk about meaning. Let's talk about the thesis of what would have been a section on meaning. The thesis is that in some ways it's the hardest of all these areas to make sense of. One reason is that you get a kind of meaning, call it proto-meaning, in simple biological systems, because their relationship to their environment is, in a proto-sense, meaningful to them. My little single-celled organism that swims toward the toxin has done an action that has a meaning to that organism, namely it dies. And if it's the last, Stu Kaufman likes to speak of the last trilobite, and has a predator coming and has to jump either left or right, takes a guess, jumps left, and becomes supper for some other animal. In that moment, the entire species ceases to exist. Remember, she is the last one. That is a meaningful moment. That's not just dissolution of a particular chemical structure. The same point, meaning and mysticism, I would have covered that continual quest for meaning that each of us engages in, the quest to make meaning of our existence as a whole. I would argue that that may have its roots in the kind of being that we've evolved to be, but that's a quest that inherently moves beyond any direct knowledge you could have, any gap or distance between language and what it's about. Because to find my life meaningful is to find that all the language, all the pieces, fit somehow into a single whole. If we push that one, I think it pushes us in the direction of what we might call mystical. Namely, it's a whole or entire stance that can't have a division in it, or it wouldn't be that all-encompassing meaning. You see, it moves beyond the boundaries of something that could be analyzed. It moves into the realm of the ineffable. If we had time, the apophatic. Let me conclude. In the last few minutes, I've challenged theologies and metaphysics, carried out at too great a distance from science. In the attempt to make stronger contact with the results of science, I pushed the fully naturalistic interpretation of emergence as far as it would go. An emergentist interpretation of evolution does, in fact, include many features that classical reductionism excluded. A comprehensive or holistic naturalism, we saw, comes even closer because it includes human experience within its field of study. But even using the resources of this expanded naturalism, we found that the full range of inner human experience, cannot be grasped. We found another step is required. Human thought, it seems to me, does ascend as far as the question of the ground of existence as a whole and its nature. A naturalism that extended that far would no longer be a naturalism. Indeed, if you're a naturalist and you're heading out on this route toward the ground of all things as a whole, at what point would you stop? Right? And for what reason? It seems to me if you're a naturalist, now you are skating on thin ice because you lose the orientation. That's what's fascinating about mysticism, it seems to me. That you head into a realm where you can no longer go step by step in a rational, logical way. Where that breaks down intrinsically based on the experience or the task you've undertaken. I think that fits the mystical right into the heart of the project that I pursued and the one I think we'll pursue this weekend. This perspective, finally, supports those religious practices that seek to deepen one's own interiority. The quest in the depths of one's being to bring together both the most profound levels of human experience and the most subtle presence of the divine is irreducibly mystical. Thanks very much.
So, on a slide that I think preceded the quote from Francis Crick, you had the word belief, and you had the word truth. We know how slippery belief is, but truth is also can be pretty slippery because it depends on your interpretation of truth. So,
truth is not truth,
we
Washington
have
says.
An observation grounded in evidence, how can we trust our minds to know that the interpretation of that evidence qualifies as truth?
That's a harsh question to begin with, Maynard. I thought you'd give me an easy one. So my answer to the specific question is we can't, or I don't know how we would. Two things I think we can do. We can give a definition of truth. The medievals did it, adequatio res et intellectus, the adequation of the thing and the intellect. Sounds good in Latin. And there are other competitors. But the correspondence theory of truth says that something's true, say the claim it's raining, if and only if it's raining. Right? So language and world. So I think I could give you a definition of truth, and then I could tell you for a given discipline what kinds of truths, or candidate truths, could it handle and not handle. The talk turned essentially on the claim that a naturalistic perspective can't handle the question of the truth of metaphysical beliefs. Can't handle the question of the interior meaning or interior valence of thoughts, but only their functions externally. So I can answer two related questions, but I can't answer your open question. Sorry to disappoint you.
Related to that, when Crick said you're nothing but a pack of neurons, it seems to me that he left out a few conditional phrases. One which would be, believe me, you're nothing but a pack of neurons. I can't explain it. So when someone says something like that without an explanation, which is kind of what you're getting at when you, towards the end of your talk, when you started talking about certain aspects of consciousness and all that, it's referred to in philosophy as the hard problem, not for any reason, because it is a very hard and difficult problem that currently lacks an explanation as far as I can tell. So would you comment on that?
Mm-hmm. So I think philosophy of mind is one of the most fascinating branches of philosophy, and there are a number of people here in the room who are very advanced in their work on it. In Conscious Mind from 1996, Chalmers gave us 3 possibilities. Let's make sure I can find them. Panpsychism, reductionism, so eliminativism, dualism. That was it, right? Somebody check me. Yes?
Dualistic monism?
I don't think that wasn't in the book, but we can throw it in, Ilya, since you're the host. But let's just take those 3. So he basically said we have to choose between these, and I don't like any of them. So recently at conferences, and he does one in Tucson, he's saying the same thing. I don't still know. Actually, he's inclined more toward panpsychism, which some of my colleagues will point out tomorrow. But those seem like ongoing questions, how to interpret mind. Right? Is there fundamental dualism of mind and matter? I've argued not, right? Though there will be a dualist, partially dualist talk tomorrow. Is everything suffused with mind? I've bet against. One of my colleagues at least thinks it's possible. Or is mind an illusion? And finally, with that pack of neurons, we're going to take care of what we thought was mind. If philosophers and scientists work long enough on this question, do you think we'll answer it?
No.
I thought that was behind the question.
Because, well, there's a famous example in philosophy of the Frank Jackson's Mary.
I was thinking about Mary. I even put in her red hat in the talk.
So Mary was raised in a black and white room. She never saw color, and yet she had learned everything science ever will know about color and the brain. And one day she went outside and saw color for the first time, and she learned something new that she had never was able to learn and understand from science.
So tell me your first name again.
What?
Your first name.
EJ.
EJ. So EJ makes a case that we can't eliminate mind. So that third position I offered can't be right. When you experience red for the first time, you learn something new. That's EJ's case, right? Which Jackson held. I don't think he still holds that view, right?
No, he doesn't, but that's irrelevant.
Well, not to him. Right. So I have to be really honest here. I will go on thinking about this question until I die. In fact, I hope the last word, I hope that the last word that I say is not Mary was right. But unless my wife is married. But I don't think, so personally I'm skeptical about coming to an answer. And the reason is you have to change the terms, as Georg does in his research, I think, of the debate. If you start it in this way, the question of the hard problem, it's posed in such a way that I suspect it can't be answered, except by changing the question or changing the frame in some way. Because Ilya put the word mysticism or the mystical in the title, I thought I would take that skepticism that I bring and try to build a bridge for you to what might be called a mystical position. That is, this is what I'm trying to say at the end, that when you immerse yourself in interiority, you have an experience of that thing which, say for EJ, is disputed, is denied, and is misunderstood. And that you don't need to have the philosophical platform first in order to immerse yourself in those practices of interiority. EJ, that's where I think I was going with that. Can I just say a word in memory of Owen Thomas, a mentor at Graduate Theological Union for many years? Owen argued a decade and a half ago, that spirituality is the wrong term. That what we really should be pursuing, this is clear in the Middle Ages, is interiority, or the inner life. Not a coincidence that Billy used it. The word spirituality didn't occur in any of your materials. And so Owen was somebody who a long time ago, well, people saw it 600 years ago, but in the current debate, asked that question, what I just said, that space of interiority that you can pursue. That's a much sharper description of a set of practices, and then, if I may, an opening for an experience of inwardness that doesn't have to solve the philosophical problems in order to be pursued. And that is my direct response. And you get to ask a criticism, place a criticism, but that's my direct response to your question.
Yeah. It's really,
you need a microphone, though.
Yeah. Oh. I mean, so the term interiority itself, you know. So what strikes me here is language, naturalistic, interiority. You brought us through a lot of biology, right? DNA and neurons, my favorite. What is interiority? In a sense, I mean, you might talk of it in terms of meaning, you might talk of it in terms of experience, but you cannot, so what's interesting in your talk, if I can say this, you can't separate the biological from the depth dimension of the biological. So if we want to use the word mystical, I don't know what, but in other words, even if we say science measures this, science can say, but it's always the scientist measuring, right? Always subject. So you leave, I think you leave me with an expanded mystery of the problem itself, of mind and matter.
Which is where you wanted to go.
Exactly.
So I didn't leave it to you. Already had it, and I came here to make sure they understood.
You just made it worse.
Why it's the best position on the topic. So building, we're obviously not in opposition on this, so let me build on what you just said with two thoughts. What is interiority is how you began rhetorically, probably. But philosophers are always those who take rhetorical questions and said, let me give you an answer. Interiority is at first negatively defined. So the point of neuroscience is that I can understand whatever is going on inside you, brain firings, Dan Dennett would say, by looking at your behaviors. We can do tests of your body, we can look at hormone changes, we can look at homeostasis, we can watch your external behaviors. But as a neuroscientist, do we ever know that you're not a zombie? Do we ever know for sure that you have an interiority at all? And I'm going to suspect that we don't. If your body responds in exactly the ways that you respond, I'm going to project onto you feelings like the ones I have inside. But I'll never know for sure that you're having the kinds of feelings that I am. And if you they like it too. And if you describe it, those are behaviors out into the world. By definition, you can't take the interiority and take it outside, right? You lose something in the translation. So that would be my understanding of an interiority that we can't get rid of. And second point, if you do head into that to explore it, what happens? It has to be by definition. Oh, there we go. Now he's jumping up. It has to be by definition of space. Okay, I'm going to stop mid-sentence because now we have interesting guys jumping up to ask questions.
I was inspired to stand up partly because I saw someone else do it. Partly because my question is on the same sort of line of thinking. I was really interested in the slide that you had of the Buddhist monk with all this sort of equipment on his head. And when you were discussing that slide, you were talking about sort of the practice of compassion meditation, and we're speaking in terms of ideas, but it sort of occurred to me that the way I've had meditation sort of explained to me is it's not so much about ideas. In a way, the whole point is to sort of let all that epistemic junk just sort of flow by. Mm-hmm. And you sort of attune to the breath and to the states of the body and things like that. So there's that side of interiority that maybe has to do with a sort of ground level of consciousness. And then on the other hand, there's the question of language that was brought up too, which is another sense. And I think that sense is maybe a secondary interiority, right? Because language is something that we get from other people, always. And so in a way, maybe the interior is divided between these two things, one which can only ever be interior to me, and the other that I have to get from someone else.
Yeah.
So I wonder how you...
Yeah. So I think those two questions are actually linked as one because of the role of language externally and internally. But let me leave that aside and say the reason why I love your question is that it suggests a project that I didn't even touch on, and that is, it sounds strange, comparative theories of interiority. Only a philosopher would think about that. No, that's not true, actually. Teachers in the spiritual traditions do talk about different forms of and practices of interiority. So let's just take the Buddhist approach is that interiority, you don't discover a self at the end. You discover pratitya samutpada, the dependent arising of all things, or what Mahayana calls causes and conditions. So in the interior order, you do just keep letting go until you realize there is no self, an-atman. In Hinduism, you discover the eternal self, Atman, which turns out to be not different from Brahman, the ground and whole of all things. And then that subdivides into 60 views within Hindus. Now, then I thought of centering prayer. Centering prayer is a focusing to find God in the self, or God through the self. It's a kind of meditation. It's very much about interiority, and yet it's radically different from the other two. Is that in tension with this sort of more mystical notion that you and I have of interiority, that we can analyze different approaches? It seems to contradict what I've argued in the talk.
I'm going to do a little tomorrow on that.
She's going to tell you the answer tomorrow, so we're okay. Good.
Thank you.
So I'm feeling disoriented. Does that mean I'm having a mystical experience?
No, it means I talk too fast. So sorry about that.
Okay, so you talked about emergence in its weak, strong, and expanded forms. And then you get to this point, at least as I was understanding it, when you lose your orientation and you can no longer go step by step. You're sort of beyond the rational. So are you saying, there are two questions here. One is, are you saying that the rational and the mystical are two different things? Number one.
As if that wasn't hard enough. Keep going.
What's that?
As if that wasn't hard enough. But
And the other thing is, could the mystical also be natural? You know, in other words, why do we have to say that the mystical is necessarily not within the scope of naturalism?
Mm-hmm.
Nice. Mm-hmm. Those are great questions. So you weren't confused. You're actually the sharpest philosopher in the room. So, no, those are great. Can I work on them? I mean, try to think out loud. Don't ask me a third, or I'll.
I'm going to stick to the two.
Okay. I laid them out as different, the mystical and the rational. And I did it, where's Jack Caputo? Is he there? Oh, there you are. Good. I did it because I knew Jack was coming and responding to us. No, not just for that reason. But we do share that in common. There's a way in which the language is different, its sharpness, its distinctiveness has to break down, does break down of its own accord. And then you ask, well, what is that space beyond? Well, if the language is necessarily dualistic, the word and the other, like the definition of truth, right? It's the adequation, the correspondence between word and fact. And it breaks down, then word and fact aren't different. Okay? So that rationality requires the difference, the setting this is like and this isn't like the other. And mysticism is the non-difference, right? The two becoming one, or the failure of language, whatever you want, deconstruction of language. So do you see what I'm going? I think that's really a clear argument. The only trouble is, I believe that the rationalist and the mystic often meet, that the closeness of the pursuit of rationality is connected, but that's for Ilya to solve tomorrow. Okay? And then the other one should make us nervous, and that is, how do you know that the mystical isn't purely natural? And you might have said, how do you know that that interior space that seems so unique isn't purely natural? And as much as I would find that disappointing, I'm not going to play any mystical cards, but as much as I find it disappointing, I cannot show you that you're wrong. And maybe those are the varieties of mysticism we were talking about a minute ago. It's totally possible. And by the nature of the case, I can't prove that you're wrong when you say, hey, Phil, it's all naturalistic.
Which raises the question, what is naturalistic? What is natural? I think that's the question behind the question.
Oh.
Yeah.
But that one I thought I did a good job of. No, but the whole thought process was to try to go as deeply into naturalism as I could. So I've looked at the various varieties of naturalism, and I sort of took you from the most reductive to the most holistic form of naturalism I could. And then I tried to say that it breaks down in the face of what we call unitive mysticism, or the sense of oneness. You say, have you proven God? No. Have you proven that there's something, that this unitive space could never be explained by an anthropologist or psychologist? No. But I tried to show what the religious person or the mystic believes she's saying when she talks about that space beyond rationality. And I think so think of it as phenomenology. Her experience, and this is not only theistic traditions, her experience is that something happens here that ordinary language and ordinary experience can't capture.
I would leave the word natural as an open question.
Yeah, I can't answer it for sure, but phenomenologically, yes. Wouldn't we say, yeah. Most mystics wouldn't say, hey, this is all a part of great neurons firing. We'll have to come back to that.
We have to come back to
yeah. I mean, the goal of the opening talk is to open the questions so you'll all come back, right? Not to answer them, because my colleagues will do a far better job tomorrow.
Thanks, Philip. I really enjoyed your talk. Should I lift this mic?
Please.
Yeah. So I just had a question about one of your slides. About 2/3 of the way through, you were talking about the fact that in science we have at least rudimentary theories, plausible going theories about the origins of the human disposition, you might say, to religiosity, and why it might have certain universal characteristics despite the differences of cultural form. We don't have a complete theory of that, but we could imagine, right? It looks like we could imagine there being a comprehensive scientific theory of that. And then you raised the question with that would threaten the possible truth of any of the religious claims. And I just wanted to, I wasn't quite sure whether you were endorsing that concern or not, but I thought, well, you go back to the 13th century, Thomas Aquinas said you should think of God as the cause of causes, meaning you don't look for God to explain this or that particular phenomena, miracles aside, in general, but rather you kind of see God as the source of the whole system. Right, and you might, insofar as you're trying to give an explanatory argument, you might appeal to properties of the whole world system and propose God as an explanation of that. At any rate, it's consistent with Aquinas' traditional monotheism to suppose that there be a natural explanation of the emergence of religious human religiosity. After all, if God desires human beings to come to know Him, it would be a good idea that we have a natural disposition along those lines. So were you countering that? Or?
No, it's a great, so Tim's pushing a great point. And three things come to mind. First of all, and a number of people in the room know something called cognitive science of religion. I presume Georg's worked on that as well. And it has exactly that dualism, as you know. Actually, there's a great book by Michael Murray and Jeff Schloss. Forgotten the title, but about 2002 actually.
Believing Primates?
Believing Primates. And the two sides of this battle roll up their sleeve and fight. They've got great authors. So the one says, we've explained away religious belief because we can show you how it functions. And the other side says, of course God would have functions help us to see God's existence and the nature of God. And it seems like an incommensurable debate. Second point, the notion of God can be introduced through study of causal order, teleological systems, so goal-directed behavior, a number of things in the world, maybe the closest ways to comprehend God and the world's relationship to God, our relationship to God. That's, I think, your second point, and I have to acknowledge that. Still, I want to fight for my slide. And I think it has an intuitive tug, but you may show that if I acknowledge the first 2 points, I fail on this one. Right. If we have some claim that something is true or exists, and I can completely explain what it does through its functions, then I think we lose the reason to claim that it exists. So a complete explanation of some phenomenon, this is a little bit like what some philosophers of mind do in the overdeterminism argument, right? Jaegwon Kim. It's a book in 2002, but articles before that, 2000. The idea is we can completely explain what you guys call mentality through the firing of neurons. So I have no need of that hypothesis. You and I could talk about concrete cases, but do you think that argument form, in principle, can be persuasive, or is something wrong about that very form?
Yeah, it can be. In that particular case, the worry is that there's competitor explanations of the very same phenomena. And it looks like the physical is more fundamental than mental level explanation. So then you begin to worry. It seems like explanatorily idle, if the physical is indeed complete to account for the behavior that we're trying to explain, or the mental behavior. Aquinas' point, I take it, and other religious ideas could perhaps make a similar move, that we're asking a different kind of explanatory question when we appeal to God than just trying to understand what are the natural causes that gave rise to this. It's a different order of explanation altogether. It's not a competitor explanation. It's asking, why is there a system like that to begin with? Why is a world that, that has the fundamental physical characteristics that it has even deeper than biology or sociology of religion?
So do you guys see why?
For distinct explanations.
Yes. So do you see why it looks like Tim's right, and that there's a difference of kind of explanation? I'm trying to explain how this got here in terms of natural causes or something. I wanted a bad cup of coffee. But the type of explanation that's a theological explanation is a different kind altogether. It's about the whole, or it's about God's purposes. And we think of that in the Big Bang, right? That answers a particular kind of question, but God intended freely to create the world and there be beings that would worship the divine is a different kind of explanation altogether. It's my career as a philosopher to try to take those differences and find common ground, right? I like to build bridges even when they end up not meeting all the way, because I think we learned something about that. And there's where my claim in that slide comes back. So let me ask you again. Jaegwon Kim fails because we don't fully explain all mental properties in terms of brain states. So he's wrong. He hasn't fully explained that. But if I have some alleged phenomenon, I postulate something, and you can say, I can totally explain all the reasons you postulated without needing that, then if you say that, don't I have the chance to say, no, don't you have the chance to say, Phil, you have no need of that hypothesis? Okay, we should talk about this later. We're going to run out of time.
I want to let this guy
okay. I can be briefer, but we get more time to talk.
Phil, first, thanks so much for really inspiring and some big questions that you brought in tonight. I'm trying to articulate an intuition that I heard coming to a close here in your talk that maybe we haven't touched on. There seem to be different concepts of God here that you've introduced. You spend a good deal of time talking about how you don't need a sort of God of the gaps, to use the term, see, through this robust naturalism and how much it can describe. You don't need to find it in that emergence. It's not necessary. Then you talk a bit about a mysticism of experience or interiority. But you also mentioned something about a place where naturalism almost seems to exceed itself through itself. That its explanations,
say more about that.
Its explanations and what it is able to contain become so robust that you start moving toward a different kind of concept of God, where it seems like what we are, tapping into or what we're participating in maybe isn't articulated in traditional languages of God as causal and whatnot, but that still we're participating in this ground or unity of all things. And doesn't that feel like God? And so there feels like different concepts of God you've introduced here. I hope you can respond to that.
No, that's great. Let me be super brief because 2 more people. Ilya and I just did a book together with some other authors called Finding God in Everyone and Everywhere. And it was supposed to be looking at this position called panentheism. All things are within God, or within the divine, but God is also more than all things. What was really interesting is that the authors were across the map. There are some classical theists who didn't want to say that. There are a number of us who are panentheists. And then there are those who push more toward pantheism. All things are God. And your last question about naturalism expanded till it becomes theological makes me think of pantheism. Did I get where you're going with that?
That's interesting. I don't know how to articulate it as pantheism, but that's exactly where I'm after here. That there's some different understandings of God, and it may be in the end that we're unsatisfied from the standpoint of a traditional theism, but find ourselves nevertheless with theism, because our naturalism has become so expanded that it's essentially a theism. And not in a functionalist way, not in a sleight of hand way, but we are participating in something that is in some sense transcendent given what it has.
So let's keep debating this tomorrow. I should just say that I disagree. And so in this Mind and Emergence book from some years ago, I tried to carry the naturalism piece all the way to God and looked at the people who claimed they'd done that, and there are a lot of them. And I found that it failed. I couldn't convince myself it worked. I'm not a dualist when it comes to mind, but I called it a kind of theological dualism in the last chapter of that book. I tried and tried and tried to get there, and if we had time, I could tell you the 3 most famous ways that it's been done in the West. But always there was in God something more. There I agree with Tim. A kind of question, a kind of explanation, a kind of reality that it couldn't get to with those tools. The emergence doesn't go all the way. So that we'd have to debate.
Thank you.
Thanks, great questions. Carol.
First of all, thanks for your talk. Making us ask all the right questions.
Good.
I noted a tendency in your talk, and you rightly emphasized interiority of experience, that you said either it's always there from the start, and the electrons have it, or it comes very late once we have complex brains. There is, of course, another position that tries to locate the origin of interiority with the origin of life. In particular, the structure of the biological cell. A cell lives and can die. A ping pong ball has an inside and an outside, but not an interiority. The cell is a system that has to maintain its integrity and its boundary far from the thermodynamic equilibrium. In a way, life is a kind of constantly frustrated suicide, as long as you can push it, right? But once you can die, the world around you assumes a certain valence and meaning and significance. Some things are going to be pushing you closer to death, others won't. So the idea, that's something that Hans Jonas in The Phenomenon of Life has said, and Evan Thompson, once you have a cell, you have the most basic form of interiority. In your sense, with a perspective on the world, with meaning, with the most basic form of experience. And that view should not be discarded, because it tries to give a principle. It's not, doesn't go all the way to the scientist does. It's not dualistic emergentism, but it tries to draw a principle boundary, and it might make the hard problem easier to solve. Because if you can see how there's an aspect of the inside, the interiority, and there's a third person aspect on the cell, you can see how this gets all the way scaled up to what Merleau-Ponty would call meaningful behavior. Of course, you can separate it into the purely qualitative and the purely functional, but you can say that's a kind of Cartesian mistake. But what I'm saying is, all I'm saying is interiority is very important, but it may come in at a level that's neither the electron nor the brain.
Nice. I actually heard 3 different definitions of interiority in your comment.
That's very possible.
And the first one is sheer physical interiority. Inside the cell wall is a space. The second one was use the word perspective. So for the first living being, the first being on which Darwinian evolution, Darwinian selection works, there's a perspective, there's a meaning. On this one, we're completely the same. It's called Biosemiotics. It has other names. But that strikes me as exactly right. But that doesn't get to the kind of interiority that I think Ilya and I are talking about. You want to answer? I wasn't done yet. But I'm more interested.
So it wasn't actually, I didn't, first of all, it's the fact that not any boundary will do. It has to be a boundary that's a self-organizing system. It's maintained from the inside. The ping pong ball, so the point is not spatial. It has a spatial membrane.
Good, okay, now I understand.
But the point is rather that it's a system that has to maintain its integrity against disorder, against decay, against disintegration on its own. So there's a basic form of autonomy that's built into this. The ping pong ball was that. So it's not Darwinian at all, actually. The Darwinian story does not enter the picture. It's more an alternative to the Darwinian story. So it's not selectionism that enters where meaning enters the picture. It's from within.
Good. So I feel like I should channel the speaker who was my friend Terry Deacon, who was going to come and dropped out. And his response would be, well, he would say it in an hour, but his response would be, no, that can't be right. So for Terry, there are three kinds of dynamics: morphodynamics, those driven by the form of something; thermodynamics, that of the energy; and teleodynamics, which is close, I think, to what you call self-organizing. But he would say it is not interiority. In fact, he speaks of the hole at the center of the wheel. He's a Buddhist, and so he thinks of the absence of something being the interiority. The emptiness itself is interiority. But that's very different than what we would have in mind. So these are things we should tease apart tomorrow, because it's in the theme of the...
It's a precursor. Precursor for it.
Yeah, we are not, do you see we're not fully clear? He's helped me understand it. He and I have more broader discussions. So I hope that tomorrow you guys will help us clear this up. We need to know.
I'm afraid we're going to add to some more of this confusion, because it's interiority again. And in a way, because this is not a term I'm all that comfortable with, and it seems to, in your argument, and Georg was getting into this, but also the student who was bringing up the issue of language as well, is I keep on when I think of the term interiority, I think there's got to be a boundary there. And where does the boundary come from exactly? And so in that respect, doesn't interiority presuppose a kind of naturalism? Don't you need naturalism, at least in terms of having spatiotemporal bearings? That has to be presupposed in the idea of interiority?
Say why. I don't get it yet. Why?
Well, where do the boundaries come from? What are you talking? I mean, what is the boundary? So the most natural way it seemed to me to understand what you were saying when you were talking about interiority was sort of like a spirit inside a person, let's say. Okay? So we have a physical space, right? And the interiority is happening in there, right? And it's like my interiority, especially since you emphasize lived experience and stuff like that, which suggests a kind of uniqueness, right? What is defining uniqueness? It seems to be the physical body in which this spiritual stuff is happening. That's the most natural way to understand you, okay? In which case, then, naturalism is kind of presupposed, at least in providing the boundary conditions within which then the interiority happens, right? And one of the interesting points that was raised by the student who brought the issue of language up is that insofar as language is constitutive of our interiority, then it may break that boundary, right? That there's a sense in which you and I may have the same interiority by virtue of language.
Okay.
Right? And it's still a physical space, but it's a somewhat different physical space, and we start getting into extended mind country and stuff like that. But the point is, at the end of the day, that's naturalistic too. And so I'm just wondering whether, if we're going to really take interiority literally, like inside, outside, that kind of idea, then we're going to have some kind of naturalism in there.
Because the outside is naturalistic, and this is derived from that.
Well, the boundary.
The boundary
how
is
are these
naturalistic.
boundaries being defined here, right? We talk about your interiority, my interiority, right? Our interiority, perhaps, right? You see, and I'm just wondering whether that is of any problem for you.
No, these are great questions, and I hope they're just making you so excited about tomorrow you sleep in this auditorium. So, is the premise? So I want to answer in a way analogous to how Tim's distinction from before. Is your argument that if the boundary is naturalistic, then what's contained within that boundary must also be?
Well, Well, I mean, that's the question, isn't it?
Well, no, that was the assumption.
I don't want to force you to that conclusion, but it seems to me that you are relying on a naturalistic basis for at least identifying the interior. So interiority can't be identified independently of naturalism.
Uh-huh. No, it's great.
Even if, in a sense, it's something other than natural.
Yeah. So Ilya's going to shut us up in 90 seconds. So let me see if I can do this in 90 seconds. Okay?
Okay, and I'll put the microphone down. So.
No. So this is a great debate, and nobody here, well, I am not in a position to fully answer the questions. That's why it's going to be fascinating tomorrow. My short answer is, so I'm trying to avoid your conclusion by doing the kind of distinction that Tim did. There are different levels and different kinds of questions. I'm doing it about interior space. He does it about the God-world relation, if I'm understanding correctly from your work. So what are the moves available to me? I might say they're all external behaviors, the body, everything external, and that which is not that is the interior. That's not a great move. I'm going to lose tomorrow because it's defined merely as the opposite of, and therefore depends on naturalism. All right? It could be that which I postulate, a mental realm, call it, that lies behind or beneath the things that our bodies are doing now. Now I've made it epistemically unapproachable because I've said it's whatever that je ne sais quoi is that then causes our bodies to do this thing. Right? I could say it's that thing that one pursues with spiritual practices, which have the goal of going beyond our everyday. I love your negative body expressions. They're inspiring me. It's just one person's going, no, that can't be right. It makes me try to do better. And so I could do 4 or 5 of those, but now I'm at 83 seconds. Always at my back I hear this times-winged arrow drawing near. No, always at my back I hear this possibility, but it could be naturalistically explained. And I think I want to leave you with what I love most about the discussion we're heading into is that possibility cannot be eliminated. And I suppose my broader sense as a religious person is that we should live as religious persons knowing that. We should acknowledge that we don't hold all the cards and we can answer any scientist or naturalist and prove that that is the case. And I actually think faith is more profound when I acknowledge the way that I'm being pushed, when I acknowledge that I don't have a full answer, and that as a person of faith, a theist, I struggle with that. And so, therefore, I thank you for your question.